represents the perspective that brought me into the folk music world in the first place. It was written by a guy named Ralph Chaplin in 1915 for the industrial workers of the world, which still exists incidentally, just 6 months before Joe Hill was executed. Other union movements picked it up, including the AFL-CIO, which Chaplin thought was a revisionist sellout organization, and he didn't want them adopting it. It's probably the most famous union song in the world after the International. It's sung to the tune of John Brown's Body, and it's inspired by the Battle Hymn of the Republic. That's my research. The song is trite and it's a bit labored. When I was 17, a long time ago, in the 1950s, it thrilled me. Those songs were very, very much part of the corpus of kids who hung around left-wing socialist movements in the 1950s. During the McCarthyist period, there were some of us who said the world is unfair, it's divided into rich and poor people, and it shouldn't be like this. It discriminates against blacks and then, at that time, against Puerto Ricans and Romanis who lived in the stores in Bed-Stuy, where I lived, which was a very different Bed-Stuy from the one you see if you walk down the streets now. In fact, I have friends who look at Google Maps now of Bed-Stuy and tell me that I am lying when I tell them that DeKalb Avenue was little stores, store after store after store, and that there were trolley cars running down it, and that there were little fabric shops and little bakeries, and that Roman people actually lived in those stores. Yes, they did when we came here. I lived on Stuyvesant Avenue, and on one side of us there was a candy store. On the other side there was a row of garages. And on the corner of DeKalb Avenue, which was half a block away, there was a bar. And yes, people came and fell asleep in our vestibule, came through the bar. And I have always wondered why some kids from middle-class homes become business people, and some become teachers, and some become socialists. Everyone in my family was brought up with similar lessons, and the lesson was be nice to everyone. All people are equal, treat them as such. And this is New York, so I feel, but marry a Jew. And this is New York, so I feel very safe saying that. We heard, as children, we heard about the horrors that our Russian Jewish relatives were going through in the 50s. And when they disappeared, my parents worried that the disappearance was related to the cash that my parents had sent them. It was a big family. I had a lot of first cousins. They all, my first cousins on my mother's side lived in Bed-Stuy. We saw each other in the patio all the time. We were not a religious family. We were not a political family. But my cousins and my sister and brother and I became musicians, social workers. My brother became a doctor, but he specialized in Alzheimer's research. He didn't develop a practice that would make him rich. And I became a socialist. It was a very easy connection for me. I didn't know anything about socialist theory. I did know about Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, which is an expose of the meatpacking industry. Made me lose my appetite for the first time in my life. And later, in an American Studies seminar I took in college, we looked at the relationships between work, between music and food, how people lived. And that really, I think, informed my looking at how how people lived and how the world should be organized and family structure for years and years after that time. In many ways, I think that the American Studies seminar I took, which looked at family structure and at different geographic areas and at how the way people lived and where they lived affected what they did and their religion and the food that they ate and the music that they played and their politics informed my thinking certainly as much as my incipient socialist politics. I didn't join a socialist organization until I left home, until after graduating from Brooklyn College. But I did hang around socialist organizations. When I was at Brooklyn College, when I was a sophomore in Brooklyn College, I was hanging around an organization called the Young Socialist League. The offices were on 14th Street. And one day I was walking by then we didn't live in Bed-Stuy anymore, we moved to Flatbush. And one day I was walking down the street on my way to the Avenue J bus, which many of you know, to go to Brooklyn College. And two men walked up to me, and one was a big blonde man, and the other was a little bald man, and they stopped me on the street, and they said, "Terry," and they pulled out these ID cards, and I looked at them, and without thinking, I said, "I won't name names." As though I had a name to name. Yes, they were from the FBI, and what the hell they were doing with 17-year-old kids, I haven't a clue, trying to scare us, I guess, because we had this conversation, and the conversation was about my hanging around this organization called the Young Socialist League, which was a Trotskyist organization. It was an organization of people who had left the Communist Party many years ago, believing that the Communist Party had become evil. And it was trying to recruit liberal kids like me, who were part of an organization that was in the left wing of the Democratic Party. And the FBI was visiting all of us, all five of us at Brooklyn College. And one of us who went to Columbia University, who hung around the YSL, and their conversation with me actually was kind of interesting because when I got through saying heroically, I won't name names, I pointed out to them I didn't have any names to name. I said, if you have my name and I am not a member, then you have the names of all the members. You know people in the organization. You know who's a member. You know who's an officer. You know more than I do. You understand their theory, which I don't. Not yet. I haven't learned it. And so what the hell do you want from me? And they knew. My sister was 2.5 years older than me. My sister went to Brandeis. And one of the reasons I went to Brooklyn College was because Brandeis was very expensive. It was costing my parents $1,000 a year. And they could not afford to have two kids in expensive colleges. So I was going to Brooklyn College probably to save them money. So, and they started, they said to me, you have a sister, her name is Joyce, and she studies, and this is who she rooms with. I mean, the amount of research they had done on my sister was unbelievable. And then they wanted to, I don't know what they wanted me to tell them, because we never really got to that. They wanted me to, quote, talk to them. And I said I would talk to them. And they said I should think about it. They would come back in 2 weeks, and I should decide whether or not I would talk to them. So they came back in 2 weeks, and I said, go away. I don't want to have anything to do with you. And you know what their threat was? They threatened to tell my parents that I was hanging around the YSL. And you know what? I was scared. I really was. My parents knew that their kid was a socialist because she had a big mouth and she walked around the house screaming about socialism all the time. But they did not know that every Friday when I left the house, I was going to YSL meetings. And that's where I first heard union songs, and that's where I first met a folk singer named Dave Van Ronk, who occasionally came to YSL meetings. And then I met him at a party, and then I met him at the Figaro, which some of you may remember. It was a coffee house on MacDougal and Greenwich Street. And he walked me to the subway, and he might have taken me home, which was an hour schlep on DMT. And we were together for another 11 years and 5 weeks. And I also had been introduced to folk music by people in YSL and by an uncle and a little bit by my sister who had brought home PC stuff from Brandeis, of course, and Guthrie stuff. And at that time, the world was very small and it was all mixed up. And you heard, if you heard union songs, you heard folk music, and it was all part of the same thing. So I met Dave, and I continued my socialist activity. And in fact, he wound up joining the youth movement of the Socialist Party with me. We did not join the YSL, but we wound up both in the youth movement of the Socialist Party. And then we became part of another Trotskyist organization, and we kept that up for a number of years. But mostly we did folk music. And where was there folk music? In the village. In 1957, when I met David, there was folk music in Washington Square on Sunday afternoons. There was folk music at the American Youth Hostel on 8th Street on Sunday afternoons. There was folk music in somebody's apartment on Spring Street on Sunday evenings. And that really was it. There was no place for a young folk singer to make a living. Some of the older folk singers, people like Theo Bickel and Cynthia Gooding and Josh White, were able to play in theaters at midnight after the play closed. Places like the Theatre d'Elysée on Christopher Street, where I saw the famed Three-Penny Opera, which, yes, has stuck with me until this day. They were able to play in places like that. But for the younger folk singers, there was absolutely no place to play. So the younger folk singers got together and they organized a thing called a group called the Folk Singers Guild. And in my book, which I hope you will buy after this, I have a photograph of the membership list of the Folk Singers Guild. And if you look at it, it's not in my handwriting, I don't know whose handwriting it is, whoever was secretary at that time. But it's a list of a lot of the members, and if you look at that membership list, I don't think you would recognize 3 of the people on that list from, if you retained an interest, if you are interested in folk music, if you remember it from the 1960s or 70s, you wouldn't recognize any of those people because they did not become professional folk singers. One of the things Dave and I always found interesting was that people who mostly, and I mean this is universally true, but most of the people who became professional folk singers in New York were people who came from other places. And our theory was they did not have parents in New York who were willing to support them or partly support them. Whereas most of the younger would-be folk singers in New York did at least have a home to go to if they didn't make it as folk singers. They didn't come from wealthy homes, but they came from parents who put them through college, and they had a place to go. Whereas people like Tom Paxton and Len Chandler and Bob Dylan came here to be folk singers. And if they didn't make it as folk singers, they were stuck in New York without a home. They would have had to go a long way back someplace looking like jerks. But in New York, most of the music was in Washington Square, and you had people there like the New York City Ramblers. You had Eric Weisberg, you had Happy Traum, who was still around and who sang at my book launch. You had Barry Kornfeld, you had Paul Prestopino. I heard Woody in Washington Square in the very early days. People like Pete were a little too grown up to hang around Washington Square. They didn't do that. And folk music was not exactly seeping out of every alley. In 1960, a man named John Mitchell, who was a little bit nutty, and somebody is doing a play based on his life. And there was an audio production of it at a club called the Cutting Room a couple weeks ago, which was kind of weird. I did a brief introduction, and they have somebody playing John Mitchell, who had been one of the owners of the Figaro, and he was a very taciturn man. He was a very dark man. He knew the mob. He knew the cops. He fought with everybody. He fought with the musicians. But he opened a club, a downstairs club called Gaslight. And he opened it to give poets a place to read. His first, he opened it in 1960, and he booked poets. So what it was what we called a basket house. He brought in people who were considered beat poets. And I gotta tell you, I knew all of those people. They were considered beat poets, they were advertised as beat poets. I never in my life heard one of them refer to himself or herself as a beat poet. I ain't never heard a beatnik refer to himself as a beatnik. But he brought in people like Leroy Jones, who later became Amiri Baraka, if you remember him, Ted Jones, a guy named Bob Kaufman, and the poet would come in and the poet would read, and either the poet or a waitress, always a waitress, never a waiter, would pass a basket, and the audience would be asked to contribute and put money in the basket. And then another poet would read it, and the audience would be asked to put money in the basket. Well, there's a limit to how many times people are going to put their hands in their pockets and put money in the basket for different poets. So they had to turn over the audience. They had to have a situation in which Ted Jones would read and the audience would leave. And a new audience would come in for Leroy Jones. How do you drive out an audience? Well, John Mitchell figured, you bring in folk singers. The poet would read, the poet would get paid, a folk singer would come on, and the audience would look at the folk singer and say, wow, and split. And you know the rest of the story. Within 6 months, there weren't any poets, and the the coffee houses, and the folk singers, the young folk singers, were earning a living. It was wonderful. That was the first coffee house. Meanwhile, the bitter end opened around the corner, and a while later, Gertie's Folk City, which was a liquor club, not a coffee house, opened a few blocks away, and it served liquor, not coffee, which made it a totally different kind of thing. Because to play in a club that served liquor, a musician had to join the union. And something kind of interesting happened. A lot of other little coffee houses opened. So you walk down MacDougal Street, you walk down 3rd Street, you walk down Bleecker Street, and yes, music is pouring out of stores that have been turned into coffee houses. All of those coffee houses are now basket houses, passing the basket to pay the folk singers, except for the Gaslight, the Bitter End, and Gertie's Folk City, which paid, you don't call them salaries, I guess. They paid by the gig. They hired musicians and they paid them for working for a week or for 3 days. And John Mitchell, crazy as he was, started that. So I salute him tremendously because the people who paid to play the Gaslight and the people who played the Bitter End were humiliating themselves. They did not have to put their hands in their pocket, and say, hey, pay me please. After about a year, we organized, I was not a folk singer, but I became Dave's manager. I'll tell that story in just a minute. But just to go on with this, we organized the musicians, the folk singers, in the basket houses, the people who were still passing baskets, and we got them to all say, we want to be paid. We want to be paid for an evening, for 3 days, for a week, whatever. We want to be paid just like the people in the Gaslight paid. And we went to local 802 of the AFM, the American Federation of Musicians, and we said, look, we have all of these musicians. Can you still hear me? Am I okay? Mm-hmm. Good. We have all of these musicians who want to join the union. And they looked at us like we were crazy. And they said, folk singers? Folk singers aren't musicians. Go away. And they literally would not sign up for folk singers. Except if the folk singer played in a liquor club like Gertie's Folk City, the folk singer had to join the union. Just like the club owner had to pay off the mob. It was the village. Every club owner in the village, except John Mitchell, and I understand Artur Lugoff, who owned Village Gate, which was a jazz club. Everybody paid off. And after John Mitchell sold the Gaslight to other people, those other people paid off. There was an envelope, it was called Grease, in the Abbey kitchen. And when the cops, the 6th precinct came in, and they got their cut. But there was this period when you had music began being heard up and down MacDougal Street. My role in it, I was a performer's girlfriend, then I became a performer's wife because Dave and I went legal after a couple of years. And I want to add something. This is my own personal little thing that I like to add. Dave and I broke up. Dave and I were together for 11 years and 1 week. We broke up. A lot of my book and a lot of my stories are about me and Dave. David and I did not spend the rest of our lives pining away for one another. When we broke up, we were very, very good friends. We broke up because we found each other. We found ourselves turning each other into nervous wrecks, and and we couldn't stop it, but we were good friends, and we adored each other the day we broke up. We did not go around pining for each other, but we also didn't hate each other. We stayed very, very good friends. We had a lot of respect for each other. I'm friendly with his widow. She died many years ago. He was friendly with the guys I lived afterward. But my story in the folk music world is the story of me and him. So at one point, he had a manager, a guy from Detroit. Most young folk singers did not have managers, and we were very pleased that he had a manager. I booked him into a club in Pennsylvania. By now, there were also coffee houses, mostly, in places outside of New York City. So there were places, coffee houses in Pennsylvania. The very first was a place called Cafe Lena in Saratoga Springs. There were places in Boston and Cambridge, in Detroit. There had been places in California even before there were places to work in New York. And again, in my book, I told the story of Dave going to California for 6 months to try to earn a living before anything opened in New York. But this guy was me a gig in someplace in Pennsylvania, and the club clearly was going to fold. It just wasn't going to make it. You could smell it, you could feel it. There was no audience, and it wasn't because it was Dave. The club just wasn't doing well. And we called, and he was booked in there for a week. And we called his manager, and we said, what should we do? The manager said, you signed a contract. Work out the contract, and we will take the guy to court. Well, you've all heard the phrase, I don't know where it comes from. You sue a beggar and you get lice? Duh. We knew that would happen. You know, he worked out the gig, and we knew he had to work out the gig. He worked out the gig, he got stiffed, we never got paid, and he fired his manager. And he said to me, be my manager. Well, I was in graduate school at the time. He was actually, by then, he was actually making enough money so that we could afford for me to not work and to go to graduate school. There were no American Studies programs in the city colleges, and I had to go to the city college. We couldn't afford anything else. And you must remember city college was free at that time, even in graduate school, graduate program. And I was majoring in political science, which I hated. I really hated it. I didn't like the way it was taught. And I had all of these teachers, and by now I was a Trotskyist, and all of these teachers kept telling me I was a dupe of the communists. And it just made me sick. So I had finished all my coursework, and David said, be my manager. And I figured, I'll do my thesis later on. And I became his manager, and it was a lot more fun. And I didn't go back to graduate school until the 80s, when I got a stupid, useful degree called Master's in Public Administration, which was a bullshit degree that would help me become director of a not-for-profit organization. So I became his manager. And I was not a big hotshot professional manager. I just wanted to work with people I thought were wonderful. And I thought Dave was wonderful as a musician. And I thought the Holy Modal Rounders were wonderful as musicians. If any of you remember the Holy Modal Rounders. And then one night, David came home and he said, I heard this kid tonight, and I think you should go hear him. I think he's a genius. So the next night, I trotted down to a basket house where people pass the basket, where this kid who had just come to New York was playing. And I looked at this little boy, and he had just hit New York about 2 days before that. It was midwinter. And he was stumbling around, and he was stumbling on stage, and he was stumbling off stage, and he had this funny kind of grin, and he would take his hat off really don't. But Bob Dylan and I and Dave became very good friends. And then he met this young lady named Susie Rodlow, and I'm sorry, am I too off my? Yeah, and we became very good friends. And one day, about 4 months later, Bob said, "Will you get me gigs?" And we worked out an arrangement where I was going to be his manager, and I wouldn't take any commission on any gigs until he was earning enough money. What was enough money? I don't know. We must have worked out something. But whatever it was, it never really happened. And I went down to the Gaslight, and I made a tape of Bob, and I took it to a commercial studio. I recorded him on an Ampex, a very, very good tape recorder that I had bought for David. And I took this big tape. I don't know if anybody here remembers like large reels of tape. And what was I going to do with this large reel of tape? I wanted to play it for people in Pennsylvania and here and there. So I took it to a recording studio, and I had them make me a little cassette. And I'm sure some people here remember cassettes. Cassettes were very little, and you could play them on very little machines. And I could take the machine to Springfield, Massachusetts, which I did, and play it for the club owner there. I said, "Go away, he's no good." And I could take it to Boston and play it for the guy in the Golden Unicorn. I said, "Take it away, he's no good." And for the Club 47, he said, "Blah." And I could take it to the guy in Pennsylvania who said, "Why should I hire him when I can hire Jack Elliott?" Because at that point, Bob Dylan sounded like Woody Guthrie. And he sounded like he was imitating Jack Elliott, who then sounded like he was imitating Woody Guthrie. So I schlepped it around, and nobody wanted him. I got him some gigs. I remember there were a couple in New Jersey, and I got him a concert of one kind or another. I wanted him to play Birdie's Book City. And I got him a gig in Saratoga Springs, in the coffee house in Saratoga Springs. The way I got that was every time the owner of the Cafe Lena needed a performer at the last minute, they only booked for the weekend. They booked for Friday and Saturday because they didn't have any business during the week. This was Saratoga. They would call me and say, we need somebody. And Terry would hit the phone, and she would call her friends, and she would call Len Chandler and Tom Paxton and Abby Trown and everybody, Alex Duncan, everybody else was around. And she would find Lena a performer. And I had done this a lot of times. So I called her, and I said, I want you to hire this young man. And I played her the tape, maybe over the phone, I don't remember. And she said no. And I said, you owe me. It's the only time in my whole life I have ever said to anybody, you owe me. I said, you owe me. I want you to hire him. And they hired him, and he went up there, and he bombed. The audience hated him. And her husband got on stage and lectured them and said, you people are stupid. You should listen to this guy. This guy is a genius. And someday he's going to be a big star. And you're going to feel like an idiot. You're going to say, I had a chance to hear him. And I talked through his set. So you should listen to him. And the next day she called me and she said, you got your favorite. Don't ever ask me for money. And a year after that, she brought him back to play. And of course, they started boasting that they were the first club out of New York that hired Bob Dylan. And that's the way business goes. It goes like that. So I want Bob to play. I want Bob to play Birdie's Book City And I nudged the owner of Greenwich Folk City, and so did everybody else in folk music. And I have thought about this. If Dave and I thought this kid was a genius, everybody in the music, in the folk music world in New York thought this kid was some kind of genius. When I started to write this book, and I was thinking about the pictures, I don't have a lot of pictures of me, old pictures of me. I don't have a lot of old pictures of Dave. Some people were photographed a lot, some weren't. For some reason, we weren't. Or, in those early days, even before he was performing, there are pictures of that kid stumbling on the curb, scratching his head, with Susie, without Susie, walking down the street, playing his guitar, sitting up in bed. He had to be the most photographed young folk singer in American history. Why? What did everybody see in this person before he ever got on stage? I don't know. And, you know, I've thought about that one, and I still haven't got a clue. So I worked with him, and I worked with some other people, and I did get him into Gertie's Folk City, and 10 other people take credit for getting him into Gertie's Folk City, and I'm sure we all were responsible for doing it. I'm sure Mike listened to everybody, me and all the other people who said, I got him into Gertie's Folk City, and everybody putting pressure on him got the gig, and Bob wound up working in Gertie's Folk City. The next thing that happened with Bob was Bob had a thing about, I don't know how many of you know Carolyn Hester. Carolyn, there weren't many women around, folk singers around. And Carolyn had a wonderful ability of swooping down on a note and hitting it just perfectly and sustaining it. And that was like in 1960, 1961. She's still around, not in New York, but she comes in often and plays. And we're still friends. And we have talked about, was the scene sexist? Was it not sexist? She talks about musicians hitting on her. Club owners never hit on her. It's really interesting, because I don't know how many of you saw the movie Inside Llewyn Davis. How many people did? I'll talk about it very briefly because I hated it. But I want to talk about it to people who never saw it. Llewyn Davis was presumably based on Dave. The Llewyn Davis character was Dave. And, I mean, of course they changed it, they changed the story, they changed him, but it was taken, a lot of it was taken from David's memoir, The Mayor of MacDougal Street. Some of it, there are stories in there that are real, like about going to Chicago, to the Gate of Horn, about losing his Siemens papers and going to the Union. And the Union guy makes a very, very funny, snarky crack about being a Shackmanite, which you have to have been a Trotskyist back in the 1950s to understand. Mostly what they did was they changed the time. It's about a time in the folk music world, partly before Dave and I were together, and partly when he was performing, but mostly the early period. And they moved on back into that period, and they bring a couple named Jim and Jean, who were performers, back into that period. For what reason, I don't know. We never were friendly with them, but they take my very, very smart, interesting, talented ex-husband and they turn him into a schmuck. They make him a real asshole, and I don't like it. And they take the folk music world of that period, and they take what was an incredibly supportive scene in which people were kind to each other and nice to each other and helped each other and supported each other and taught each other songs and helped each other get gigs and recommended one another to club owners and put one another up on couches and it was just a wonderful, happy world. And they turn it into a cutthroat, ugly world. And that piece I don't understand. The thing that I like most about that movie is they have the Llewyn Davis character, who is supposed to be my ex-husband, and they have him knock up a chick. They have him impregnate a young girl. All right, they have him impregnate a young girl. And she tells him she's pregnant, and he says, I will take care of you. Doc, in 1950-something, they have him go to the corner office of a local gynecologist, and he bounces into the office, and he says, I did it again. And the doctor says, well, that's okay. You have credit from the last one. 1950-something or other, abortion was illegal. You did not turn to your boyfriend for help and support when you got knocked up. Dave and I actually, in real life, and I can't remember whether I put this in the book, had a little abortion fund. And we kept a couple $100 in a laundry bag. And when I wrote in case people needed an abortion, and when I mentioned that on Facebook a couple of years ago, 3 people wrote to me and said, I don't know if you remember, but I used your abortion fund. But what the Llewyn brothers did in that movie is disgusting. You have credit. You can have another abortion for that young lady, whoever the hell she is. Pardon me, I think it was horrible. So what got me off on that? Something got me off on that. It was a great world. It was the folk music. The folk music world was an incredibly supportive one. And so a few months later, my thing with Bob was, and people supported him. People thought he was wonderful, and that was what the whole scene was like. Carolyn Hester. Bob had a thing about Carolyn, not a love thing, not a sex thing. He had a musical thing about Carolyn. He wanted to play behind Carolyn. What nobody knew yet, except Dave and me, because we had become very friendly and we figured it out, and Peter Stanfill of the Holy Modal Rounders, because he heard it in Bob's music, was that Bob had a rock and roll background. He didn't come out of folk music, everybody knew that. He really loved it, I think, for a year or two, or more. But his own background was if he had a thought, it might have been Little Richard. And he had very good taste in rock and roll. But he had a thing about Carolyn Hester, and he became friendly with Carolyn. He went up to Massachusetts to play harmonica, which he did play, and he played blues harmonica, and that he played well behind Carolyn. And she brought him, and he did it for nothing, up in Massachusetts. And she was going into the recording studio. She had a contract with Columbia Records, which was a very big deal in those days. Most folk singers were recording for Folkways Records, or Elektra Records, or Vanguard Records. Columbia was like, my God, it was out of reach for folk singers. So she was going in to record for Columbia, and she brought Bob in to play harmonica behind her. And he was heard by a record producer named John Hammond. And if there are jazz fans here, you know who John Hammond was. He was a producer, a record producer, who produced some of the top jazz artists of the day. And around that time, Bob also was heard by another manager, a manager who was much more commercial than me, a guy named Albert Grossman. And Albert Grossman was the guy who invented Peter, Paul, and Mary. In fact, he invited Dave to be Paul, and Dave did not think he would fit into a Peter, Paul, and Mary style group. But he invented Peter, Paul, and Mary. He was Odetta's manager, and he was on his way, and he had owned the club, the Gate of Horn in Chicago, before he came to New York to be a manager. And he approached Bob around the time Bob was about to record for Columbia. And one day Bob came to me and he said, Albert wants to manage me. And I said,